Cymbeline, Part 2. How Iachimo won his wager. The Cave of Belarius. The trunk sent by Iachimo was duly placed for security in Imogene's chamber, but it was no plate or jewels that it contained. That night, when the princess slept, a lighted taper still burning in the room, and near at hand the book she had been reading ere she fell asleep, the lid of the trunk was lifted, and a man stepped out. It was Iachimo. With rapid glance he surveyed the room, carefully studying every detail. What pictures there were, where the window was placed, what was the adornment of the bed, the arras, the figures, and the story represented. And even this was not sufficient for his purpose. He stealthily approached the bed, and while Imogen lay wrapped in deep sleep, he slipped from her arm the bracelet which Leonidas had given her, noting at the same time, on the pure whiteness of her skin, a little mole with 5 spots, like the crimson spots in the bottom of a cowslip. Next he took up the book she had been reading, looked carefully at the title, and observed the exact passage in the tale, where she had left off. Then, satisfied with his ignoble work, he went back into the trunk. The lid shut with a spring, and once more there was apparently nothing in the room to disturb the innocent serenity of the sleeping princess. In the morning early came an unwelcome suitor, Cloten. The queen's son had been advised to try the effects of music on the hard-hearted lady, who unceasingly repulsed his advances. He therefore ordered some musicians to attend outside her chamber window, and sing a charming little aubade, that is, a song of the nature of a serenade, but sung at dawn to waken the sleeper instead of during the night. The song chosen was an especially pretty one, with a wonderfully sweet air, and Cloten hoped it would not fail to touch Imogene's heart. Hark, hark, the lark at heaven's gate sings, and Phoebus 'gins arise, his steeds to water at those springs, on chaliced flowers that lies, and winking merry buds begin to ope their golden eyes. With everything that pretty is, my lady sweet, arise, arise, arise. Imogen liked the pretty music, but she was sorry not to be able to thank Cloten properly for his trouble, for she disliked him as heartily as ever, and vexed by his importunity, was forced to tell him so. Cloten tried to persuade her to give up her husband, saying that the contract which she pretended with that base wretch, one bred of alms and fostered with cold dishes, with scraps of the court, was no contract, and that the marriage could easily be dissolved. Imogen, furious that this contemptible creature should thus dare to insult the noble Leonidas, indignantly heaped scorn on Cloten, telling him that he was too base even to be her husband's groom, that he would be too much honored and be worthy of envy if he were styled the under-hangman of his kingdom. In short, she ended, the meanest garment that Leonidas had ever worn was dearer in her eyes than 100,000 men such as Cloten. Imogen had already had cause that morning for grave distress, for she had discovered the loss of her bracelet, and was greatly upset about it, leaving her clownish wooer to brood sullenly over this unusual plain speaking. For all the gentlemen at court flattered and fawned on Cloten to his face, though they roundly abused him behind his back. Imogen now called her faithful Pisanio, and bade him tell her waiting woman to make the most careful search for the missing jewel. "It was thy master's. I would not lose it for a revenue of any king's in Europe. I think I saw it this morning. I am confident last night it was on my arm. I kissed it. I hope it be not gone, to tell my lord that I kiss aught but him," she ended, with a melancholy attempt at a little jest. Alas, poor Imogen! If she had only known how fatally near the truth came her lightly spoken words. At that same moment, Iachimo was speeding back to Rome with his unwelcome tidings. At first, Leonidas took for granted that Iachimo must have lost his wager. He had an answer ready for everything that the latter could say. But little by little, the wily Italian contrived to make it appear that Imogen had been far too generous in the favors and friendliness she had lavished on this stranger. He had seen her chamber, he said, and forthwith he described all the tapestry of silk and silver with which it was hung. The chimney was south of the room, and the story of the huntress Diana was wonderfully carved as the subject of the chimney-piece. The roof of the chamber was fretted with golden cherubs. The andirons on the hearth were 2 winking cupids of silver, each standing on 1 foot. Leonidas was forced to admit that all this was true, but still, he said, it did not prove that Iachimo had won his wager. Then, with a self-assured air of triumph, Iachimo produced the bracelet, which he declared Imogen had taken from her arm to give him. Leonidas, with one last effort to preserve his belief in Imogen's love and fidelity, suggested that perhaps she had taken off the bracelet to send it to him. "She writes so to you, doth she?" asked Iachimo cunningly. But alas, Imogen's letter, which he had himself conveyed, made no mention of such a fact. "Oh, no, no, no! It's true. Here, take this too," cried Leonidas, handing Iachimo the ring which he had wagered, and he broke out into a torrent of despairing scorn for the utter falsehood and inconstancy of all women. "Have patience, sir, and take your ring again," counselled Philario, who all through this interview had keenly distrusted the plausible Iachimo. "It is not yet won. Probably Imogen lost the bracelet, or who knows if one of her women, being bribed, has not stolen it from her." "Very true, and so I hope he came by it," said Leonidas. "Return me my ring, and give me some stronger proof than this, for the bracelet was stolen." Then Iachimo told of the little mole which she had noticed on the white skin of Imogen, and Leonidas could no longer refuse to admit that he had lost his wager. He had loved Imogen so deeply, so tenderly, he had placed such absolute trust in her perfect goodness and truth, that the shock of discovering her falsehood and inconstancy was a terrible one. All women were alike, he thought bitterly. There was no fault in man that woman did not have in greater measure. Lying, flattery, deceit, revenge, ambition, self-indulgence, covetousness, pride, disdain, luxury, slander, fickleness. Every fault that could be named was found more abundantly in woman than in man. So, maddened by the supposed treachery of his peerless wife, the unhappy Leonidas began to brood thoughts of dark revenge. The Cave of Belarius. About this time there came to the court of Cymbeline emissaries from the Roman emperor, demanding the annual tribute of 3,000 pounds, which Julius Caesar had extracted from the conquered Britons, and which latterly Cymbeline had neglected to pay to his successor, Augustus Caesar. On hearing the demand brought by Caius Lucius, the ambassador, the queen at once took it upon herself to urge Cymbeline not to pay the tribute, and Cloten, in his foolish manner, chimed in with silly defiance and childish insults. With more dignity, Cymbeline confirmed the words of the queen and declined to pay, whereupon Caius Lucius pronounced a declaration of war against Britain in the name of his master, Augustus Caesar. His unwelcome duty done, he was then ready to enjoy the hospitality which Cymbeline courteously offered to him during the remaining day or two of his visit to the court, after which the king sent him with a safe conduct and an honorable escort to Milford Haven, and forthwith began his preparations for war. In the meantime, other messages had also come from Rome, letters to Pisanio and to Imogen. The one to Pisanio contained a terrible command. The one to Imogen filled her heart with joy. She was bidden to set off at once to Milford Haven, where Leonidas stated he was at that time, where he wished his wife to join him. Imogen was all excitement and eagerness to be off. She begged Pisanio with pretty impatience to tell her how quickly they could get to Milford Haven, and chid him for the slowness of his reckoning. Her quick wit at once devised a scheme whereby she could escape unnoticed, and in the guise of her waiting woman she contrived to slip out of the palace to where Bassanio was ready to conduct her on her journey. But alas, poor lady, on the road to Milford Haven, a terrible awakening awaited her. Bassanio showed her the letter he had received from Leonidas, and there she read of the crime of which he accused her, and that Bassanio had orders to put her to death. Knowing herself blameless, Imogen was nearly killed by the cruel words, and in heartbroken accents she begged Bassanio to strike at once and obey his master's bidding. But Bassanio indignantly flung his sword away, refusing to stain his hand with such a deed. He had only brought her thus far, he said, to think out what was best to be done. His master must certainly have been deceived. Some villain, peculiarly skilful in his art, had done this injury. Bassanio said he would give notice to Leonidas that Imogen was dead, sending some token of the fact, as he had been commanded. Imogen would be missed at court, and that would confirm his words. "Why, good fellow, what shall I do the while? Where bide? How live?" asked poor Imogen. "Or what comfort shall I take in life when I am dead to my husband?" Bassanio asked if she would like to return to court, but Imogen declared she would have no more of court, or father, or the clownish Cloten, who had so pestered her with his love-suit. Bassanio said that if she would not stay at court, she could not remain in Britain, whereupon Imogen asked were there not other places in the world than Britain where the sun shone. In the volume of the world, the little isle of Britain was no more than a swan's nest in a great pool. Bassanio was glad she was willing to think of other places, and went on to suggest a scheme, daring indeed, but which Imogen was only too glad to accept. This was nothing less than that Imogen should disguise herself as a page, and seek service with the Roman ambassador Lucius, and she could go with him to Rome, where she would be living near Leonidas, and, even if she did not see him, she could hear hourly reports of his doings. Bassanio, with this end in view, had taken care to provide himself with the dress of a page, which he now handed over to Imogen. Lucius was to arrive on the following day at Milford Haven, and Bassanio advised Imogen to go there to meet him and offer her services, where he would probably accept. Bassanio himself must now return to the palace, in case his absence should give rise to suspicion. But from the mountain top where they stood, he pointed out Milford Haven, and it seemed within easy distance. Finally, before taking leave, he gave Imogen the little box of drugs which the Queen had presented to him, telling her that it contained some precious cordial that would cure her if ever she were ill. So the faithful servant bade farewell to his dearly loved mistress. Poor Imogen set out with a brave heart on her perilous adventure, but the town that had looked so near seemed to recede as she walked towards it. For 2 days and nights she wandered on, almost spent with hunger, and making the ground her bed. At last she came to an opening in the side of the mountain, which looked as if it were used for some kind of habitation, for a path led to the low entrance. Imogen found it was a cave, evidently furnished for use. At first she was afraid to enter, not knowing what danger might lurk inside, but hunger made her valiant. She called, but no one answered. "Ho! Who's there? If anything that's civil, speak. Ho! No answer? Then I'll enter. Best draw my sword, and if mine enemy but fear the sword as I do, will scarcely look at it. Grant such a foe, kind heaven." So, timid and quavering in her boy's tunic, with her short, broad-bladed sword gripped in her trembling hand, Imogen pushed aside the brushwood and entered the cave. She had not long disappeared when the real owners of the cave approached. There was an elderly man of commanding presence, and 2 noble-looking youths of 22 and 23 years old. In spite of their rustic and almost savage garb of hunters, there was an air of unmistakable distinction about all three. To the frank brow and free step of the mountaineer, the lads joined a princely grace of bearing which told of high birth and noble breeding. Their appearance did not belie them, for these boys were no other than the 2 sons of Cymbeline. stolen in their infancy by a banished lord, in revenge for an act of great injustice. Belarius had been a gallant soldier, first among the best, and much beloved by Cymbeline, by whose side he had often fought the Romans. But at the very height of his renown, he was suddenly reduced to the deepest disgrace, not for any fault of his own, but because two villains, whose false oaths prevailed before his perfect honor, swore to Cymbeline that he was confederate with the Romans. Then followed his banishment and his theft of the two young princes, and so for 20 years he had lived this wild life among the Welsh mountains, bringing up the boys as if they had been his own sons, and training them in all sorts of manly exercises. In this new existence, Belarius called himself Morgan. Cymbeline's eldest son, Guiderius, went by the name of Polydore, and the younger, Arviragus, was known as Cadwal. Weary and hungry with a long day's hunting, and looking forward to a good meal from the spoils of the chase, these three were about to enter their cave, when a sudden sign from Belarius stopped the other two. "Stay, come not in, but that it eat our victuals. I should think here was a fairy," said Belarius. "What's the matter, sir?" asked Guiderius, the elder son. "By Jupiter, an angel, or if not, an earthly paragon." "Behold, divineness no elder than a boy," cried Belarius, as Imogen, alarmed by the sound of voices, came to the entrance of the cave. Terrified at the sight of these newcomers, who, for their part, stood gazing in bewilderment at the strange intruder, she began a hasty apology. "Good masters, harm me not. Before I entered here I called, and thought to have begged or bought what I have taken. Good troth, I have stolen nothing, and would not, though I had found gold strewn on the floor. Here's money for my meat. I would have left it on board as soon as I made my meal, and parted with prayers for the provider." "Money, youth?" exclaimed the elder prince disdainfully. "All gold and silver rather turn to dirt," added the second. "I see you are angry," said Imogen piteously. "No, if you kill me for my fault, I should have died if I had not made it." "Whither bound?" asked Belarius. "To Milford Haven." "What's your name?" "Fidel, sir. I have a kinsman who is bound for Italy. He embarked at Milford, to whom, being on my way, almost spent with hunger, I am fallen into this offence." "Prithee, fair youth, think us no churls, nor measure our good minds by this rude place we live in," said Belarius kindly. "Well encountered. 'Tis almost night. You shall have better cheer ere you depart. Thanks to stay and eat it. Boys, bid him welcome." At Belarius's words, the two young princes stepped forward, and with most courteous grace did their best to comfort the timid wayfarer, trying with gentle words to put him at his ease, and saying affectionately they would love and welcome him like a brother. And so, cheered and comforted, and led by the younger lad's arm thrown protectively around her, the poor wanderer entered the rude cave, which love and courtesy made so fair an abiding place.